My name is Ambassador Edward Peck. I will be your host for this, the inaugural session on Washington Times Radio to discuss events in Israel and Palestine in a manner which we have intended to be informative as well as thought-provoking, provoking thoughts, not controversy, to the maximum extent possible. We'll be broadcasting weekly, 1 hour each time on Washington Times Radio Network. And today we are in the beginning of a session that we hope will help tell Americans who are interested some things that they can beneficially know about our country. Our focus today is Gaza, where, as everyone is aware, some very bad things have happened to the inhabitants and are continuing to happen without a great deal of attention being paid to the consequences by either the American government or the American media. And here at the Council for the National Interest, we are convinced that that is not going to benefit anyone because there are various ways of dealing with the issues in the occupied territories. And for those of us who believe that Israel should have an opportunity to exist in peace and security among her neighbors, we don't think that the current path is going to lead to either of those desirable outcomes. Gaza today is under siege on land, in the air, on the water, and constitutes what is essentially the world's largest outdoor prison. People can't get in, the people can't get out, supplies can't get in, medical cases can't get out. Even students who have scholarships in the United States at prestigious universities are not allowed to leave. It's a very difficult situation for everyone, and it is quite obvious if you follow the events as they unfold that there are many people in Israel who are also unhappy, many Israelis who are also unhappy about what is being done to the survivors of the Gaza war. I have been there, so have many Americans. My memories of the visit were both depressing and uplifting, if you can understand it. Very depressing to see what the people are going through, very uplifting to see how they deal with it, with hope, optimism, patience. After all, it's been going on for some 40 years now. You begin to sense a feeling that the role of the United States in attempting to help the parties resolve the problems have given us a rather bad flavor, if you can use that word, in the region because America appears to be supporting one side, the strong side, in total abandonment of the other, the weaker side. This is not the way we in the United States normally view ourselves as conducting our international relations. And in the case of the continued occupation of Palestine, many of us think that that is not going to benefit anyone. Certainly not the Palestinians, not the Israelis, and not the Americans. Because to use a phrase that we Americans are fond of, you can't get there to peace and security from here using bombs and bullets. History shows you without equivocation that that is not going to work. I was in the Middle East in November with a pilgrimage organized by the Council for the National Interest. There were about 14 of us from around the country, all of us interested in and experienced in, and in some cases, quite experienced in the Middle East. We went to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan, to the West Bank, to Jerusalem, to Israel, and to Egypt. And this was just after the election of President Obama. And one of the reasons we went was to determine what it was that people and governments in the region expected President Obama to do, with particular respect to the Middle East. It was not surprising to discover that they expected him to solve every existing problem virtually overnight. This was the view of the people in the street to whom we spoke in all of those places. Those people working in governments or opposition groups had a more balanced approach because most of them are familiar with how the American system works, with the press and the Congress and the political parties and the people. And they realized that some of the things that Mr. Obama said he wished to do and hoped to do would be requiring a little more time, a little more effort, a little more change in attitudes and realities. So far, they have seen none. There's a team going out later this month to visit essentially the same places and with some of the same people. I am very much afraid that they will find that the mood has darkened considerably, especially since the ferocious attack on Gaza that Israel launched not too many months ago. It isn't a question, of course, for Americans to change their views or change their opinions, but we do think here at the Council for the National Interest that it's useful to have as much information on the subject as you can, especially if it's presented in a non-confrontational and, as to the extent that it's possible, unbiased opinion. Everyone who has been in Gaza recently, whoever they are, Israelis, Americans, Palestinians, Europeans, Mr. Goldstone from the United Nations, recognizes and testifies that the situation there is desperate, truly desperate, and getting worse and becoming dangerous for the entire region. And if it's dangerous for the entire region, it's also dangerous for us. So could things be done? Yes. Could situations change? Yes. But for us, for Americans, an informed electorate is clearly and most importantly the key step in getting Americans to understand and be informed on and become involved with efforts to resolve the issues there so that all of the people in the region can live in peace and security. I'm going to be joined now by Eugene Bird, who is the president of the Council for the National Interest and has been for many years, a gentleman with a foreign service and business background in the Middle East who has devoted the last couple of decades to efforts to find an easier, better, safer, more productive, and mutually acceptable solution to problems that, in the eyes of those who do not know as much as he does, appear intractable. Gene, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Ed. Let me say that I feel very flattered having to substitute because of difficulties with the telephone system from Gaza, which worked perfectly earlier this morning when we tested it. Worked okay yesterday, part of the time, but obviously there's lots of difficulties with communications from Gaza at this point. And I'm talking here as a substitute for a very famous former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, famous journalist Takrib El-Quderi, who is sitting there on the telephone trying to get through to us, I suppose, and maybe she'll make it before the end of the hour. I'm substituting for, in this program, Gaza first. Before the peace process, let's open up Gaza to freedom of movement, freedom of traffic, both to Israel and to Egypt. And maybe the peace process under the Mitchell-Obama formula will actually produce something.
Welcome back. My name is Edward Peck. I'm a former American ambassador in the Middle East, and I'm hosting this effort to get the program series started. This is our first effort, and we're having some difficulty in reaching the individual that we hoped to interview in Gaza, who is one of the prominent individuals in that area, Takrib El-Quderi, who was the New York Times correspondent there and a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard. We have not been successful in reaching her, although we had her on the line before the program started. One of the things I thought I might call to your attention, in keeping with the earlier commentary that our effort here is to provoke thoughts, not people, is a phrase that President of CNI, Eugene Bird, used just a few moments ago when he referred to the peace process. I'm concerned by the use of that phrase. It sounds, peace process, as if there are two nations at war and we are interested in getting them to have peace. But it isn't a war. It's an occupation. I use that word with a small o, not a capital O. A peace process leaves you with the mental image of two nations with borders and armies to defend them, trying to find peace. That is not the situation either in Gaza or in the West Bank. Palestinians have never had an army. They've never really had a border in modern times. They are occupied. And so when you speak of peace, you tend to create a mental image of two equal parties trying to reach an agreement. But the parties are not equal. One is the occupier and the other is the occupied. So I find that speaking constantly about the peace process leaves most Americans with a picture of the situation there which has almost nothing to do with reality. And I think that most of us would agree that a sense of reality is an important ingredient when you're dealing with important, complicated, and potentially very dangerous situations. We have intended to have this program, the series of programs, bring people closer to an understanding, a rational, reasonable understanding of what the situation there is really like. Let's turn very briefly to this recent discussion, if you can call it that, about the Goldstone report prepared by Dr. Goldstone for the United Nations on the possibility of violations of human rights when Israel re-entered Gaza in January 2009. The Goldstone report, which is lengthy and balanced and you could say rather cold because it discusses horrific events in balanced, rational, non-polemic language. The Goldstone report has been rejected by the government of Israel and by many people in the United States as being biased and unfair and irrational and hostile to Israel. And I suppose, depending upon your point of view, it can be seen that way if you consider that it is designed to do bad things for Israel. But it isn't. It is designed to give the rest of the world a better understanding of what it was that happened in that particular military operation in an occupied, surrounded area. Because of the nature and strength of the negative reactions, the Goldstone report has kind of gone into a limbo where it may be another 6 months before the General Assembly considers voting it or passing it on to the Security Council for discussion. It deserves being read. It's easily read. It's not pleasant. It isn't fun. You don't come out humming the title song. It tells you some things about what happened there and explains, if you read carefully, America's involvement in financing and equipping what Israel did so that you can better understand, without having to agree, why it is that many people in that part of the world and elsewhere feel that what happened was a violation of all of the things that America and Israel consistently insist they stand for. Justice, human rights, international law, all of that went out the window. It was a disastrous experience for the Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, and could turn out to be a very unfortunate thing for Israel and her principal supporter, the United States, which is, of course, why we should be interested. Not only interested, but informed. Therefore, this program as a start to get people to understand a little better the very difficult and, in my mind at least, unacceptable situations that exist in the occupied territories. Every single one of us who looks forward to the day when Israel lives in peace and security among her neighbors recognizes that attaining that goal, which in the minds of everyone is desirable, will not be possible if the current policies in the occupied territories continue. And I recall just about a year ago when Israeli President Peck, speaking at the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York, said that the current path being followed by the Israeli government will lead to a catastrophe. This same sentiment was echoed by then Prime Minister Olmert just a few months later. Each of them used different language, but what they said is that you can't continue to do what you are doing. We cannot continue to do what we are doing and expect to live in peace and security among our neighbors. And that seems to be the opinion of everyone who takes a rational, balanced view. I remember as a much younger man hearing Prime Minister Golda Meir of Israel, and she was not a fuzzy puppy, Golda Meir. She used a phrase, it wasn't original, but I consider it to be extremely important. She said, "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, because you do not have to make peace with your friends." painful though it may sound, that is certainly logical, reasonable, and has been proven. As an illustration, I offer you a look back at the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were daggers drawn all over the world, where our surrogates had fought each other in various places. We had helped our surrogates, and the surrogates had received assistance from us in various ways when we thought they could do it. In Afghanistan, we helped the Taliban against the Russians. In Vietnam, the Russians helped the North Vietnamese against us. And we kept in touch with the Russians all that time, not because we loved them and trusted them, but precisely because we didn't. That's how you advance your interests. And Israel can consider that because the United States and the Soviet Union never fought a war. We came all through that Cold War, which is why we called it cold, without efforts to attack one another. We had commissions, delegations, exchanges, committees, a hotline, precisely for the purpose of avoiding difficulties with people with whom we had major problems. That has proven over time to be a very, very effective system for advancing your interests. Welcome back to Jerusalem Calling. I would like to bring back to the microphone Eugene Bird with extensive, unmatchable experience in the Middle East. Gene, are you there?
I am here. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, sir.
I'd like to make one point here, and that is that the Palestinian people deserve at this point to have a state. Harry Truman recognized Israel without recognizing any borders. In fact, he didn't even recognize the borders specified by the United Nations only 6 months before. It's time for the United States to recognize Palestine without specifying borders. I'm sure that more than 100 countries would follow, and it would place it somewhat on a same basis, shall we say, even though the Palestinians would continue to be under occupation and Gaza would continue to be under siege unless the United States took some measures beyond that. We think Gaza first should be tried. Palestine should be recognized now without specifying borders.
Gene, you were around when Mr. Truman made his decisions some years ago, as I recall.
You're making me feel ancient now. Yes, I was.
No. You had already been out in that part of the world as well, as I recall.
No, I hadn't in 1948, but I followed it closely. I was a journalist on the United Press at that time.
Have there been any efforts to bring this up, for example, in Congress or through some other efforts, the question of recognizing Palestine as an entity, even if you don't recognize the borders?
That's the great thing about it, Ed. It doesn't require a congressional assent. The president can, as head of the foreign policy of the United States, can simply issue an executive order that he's recognizing Palestine, and the borders will be specified later.
I'm sure that the president could have as the senior foreign policy person, but he also has to consider the reaction of the Congress and his party to taking such a step. And I don't think that he could do it without consulting, or would do it without consulting extensively with those groups plus the American public. Has anyone ever floated the idea out there?
We have floated it in New York Times ads, and we've floated it in some of our letters to our 10,000 constituents across the country. We have people in every state. The reaction, of course, from them has been very, very positive. There's been utter silence from Congress, of course. Frankly, I think it would help the state of Israel to get to peace with her neighbors if the Palestinians actually had a state. It might even accelerate the Israel-Syrian track, which a lot of the Israelis are hoping will get around the difficult question of how do you divide up Palestine between Israeli Jewish and Israeli Palestinian or Palestinian. There are 5 million reasons why Israel should now herself recognize Palestine and negotiate with it. That are the 5 million Palestinians west of the Jordan River.
I recall very clearly when we met on some of the Council for the National Interest pilgrimages to the Middle East with Palestinian leaders who raised the question of reciprocity. using the case of both the PA and the PLO and Hamas, and the United States insisting that they have to recognize the state of Israel, and the Palestinians saying, but where are the borders? When you recognize a state, you're recognizing an entity with lines on the ground designating where the country is. And secondly, how can we recognize Israel when Israel doesn't recognize us? That's the reciprocity issue that diplomats always bring up. Have they talked about that in the ads and so forth, that there should be a reciprocal exchange of recognition as a means of starting a process for ending the occupation and giving both parties peace and security?
Yes, I think so. And frankly, if the Palestinian state was recognized, the grave problems, the 3 or 4 gravest problems, Jerusalem, the wall, borders for Israel, borders for Palestine, which of course would be the same, and the problem of the refugees, would be much easier to dialogue and for the United States to support or not to support certain measures that might be negotiated by Senator Mitchell or that the president really wants. I think the president wants to recognize Palestine by the year 2011. I see no reason why he can't recognize it right now.
I would tend to agree with you that that would be a start. It would be a difficult program. You know, it's interesting. I remember so clearly seeing a headline in the Washington Post here not too long ago, in which the Republicans in Congress said in the headline, Republicans in Congress tell President Bush that the war in Iraq is harming the party. Oh, now there's a critical issue, that it's harming the party. Clearly something needs to be done. And we do have political parties in this country, at least 4 or 5, if it depends on who you speak to. It might be a difficult sell. I would like to see him try